I'm with Chris Gloninger, the chief meteorologist at KCCI. That's the CBS affiliate in Des Moines, Iowa. Chris was in the thick of the coverage last night through the storms that raced across Iowa. Chris, thanks for joining us this morning. Appreciate it.
Absolutely, John. Happy to be with you.
So walk me briefly through what it was like there going into the afternoon and ultimately evening and covering the severe weather and kind of what you saw and how it played out.
You know, Sean, this was one of those forecasts where confidence was high for a week. We have an 8-day forecast. 8 days out, we had temperatures into the low 70s. We put up a 71 degrees, I think, around day 7. And if you think about that, that isn't just breaking a record in Iowa. That is breaking not just a daily record, that broke in a daily record for the entire month of December. It's never been warmer in this month. So we knew that this day had the potential, especially if you had a dynamic system moving in. And then that became a little bit clearer as we got into the weekend, that this would be a day where we could certainly see an active severe weather setup across Iowa. And then the day before, we saw a slight risk of severe weather that the Storms Prediction Center put out. I think it was the first December day 2 slight risk that they've ever included Iowa in. And then that 12:30 a.m. Central Time update, they went from a slight risk to a moderate risk. I texted my weather team and said, get ready for a pretty big day.
Yeah, and for people who aren't very deep into the weather enterprise, moderate risk sounds like, it's not that big of a deal. But, I think technically that's like 15% chance of getting a storm at any one spot. And I was telling people that, if you went to a restaurant, they said there was a 15% chance your meal was going to send you to the hospital with food poisoning, you probably would need it. So these are the kinds of messages that we need to beef up and strengthen with the community. I read briefly this morning, there's still about 500,000 customers without power, not necessarily unique to Iowa, but across the plains. Remind people now that the storm is over that it's cold again, right?
It's tough. This was a dramatic temperature drop, and across parts of Nebraska, there were snow squall warnings almost immediately following the severe thunderstorm and tornado warnings that they had. So that is how dramatic of a temperature drop we saw. Temps in the 70s, tumbling down into the 20s and 30s with damaging winds. What a remarkable setup for this time of year. And going back to your point of the moderate risk, as you mentioned, may not sound like a lot, but if you use a 5-point scale, think of it as a 4 out of 5, then that really puts it into perspective that it's going to be a busy day across not just our state, but a good portion of the plains and upper Midwest.
And I was checking with some colleagues in DC, and I want to confirm, let's see if you've read this too, that this is the first occurrence of a tornado in December in both Iowa and in neighboring Minnesota. Is that what you read too?
That's correct about Minnesota. There have been 5 on record in Iowa during the month of December. But as of this point, as of this conversation, we saw 11 tornado reports across the state. So we very well could have doubled the number of tornadoes that we've seen since tornado records have been kept back in 1950 in one single day.
From what you can see, because oftentimes we'll get the tornado reports and there are multiple reports of the same cell. Have you got any kind of sense just off the top of your head that, there may have been 2 or 3 long-term tracks, or there are 2 or 3 specific storms or cells that got these multiple reports, or do you have a sense for that yet?
Judging by the damage and where the damage is located, a couple of those reports, I think, were with the same area of circulation that may have cycled a couple of times. But then there was a report of train spotters that saw twin tornadoes. So there's 2 out of the 11 right there that were part of that report. And then there was the Guthrie and Greene counties area that saw near Jefferson a rather large funnel that moved through, one of those stovepipe tornadoes that moved up from Atlantic up into Jefferson. That may have cycled a few times, but was part of that same circulation. However, that entire line had spin-ups along it as it went from Nebraska and into Iowa.
Yeah, and I think that the other thing that I think about a lot is this really started onset, from what I could tell, right around nightfall, coming into the western part of Iowa. And then, we're relatively used to having tornadoes in the late afternoon and evening in the spring where we still have light to 6:30, 7:30 into the evening. And this is not the case. Can you just speak about how much more dangerous that is? I mean, part of it is obvious, but what else could you speak to?
And typically you're used to, once you lose that daytime heating, storms begin to wane after sunset. Not the case when you have such a dynamic setup with a lot of energy. But we didn't have the luxury that residents across Nebraska had, which I hate calling it a luxury, but they did have daylight when these storms moved through.
Yeah.
And we were seeing the images coming in when Lincoln had a wind gust to 93 miles per hour, what that did. For us, it was a great team effort with our field crews that were strategically deployed so we could see some damage. But it wasn't until this morning that we really saw the scope of the damage. And certainly when you look at power outages, that is a good benchmark to see, what level this is, what kind of level impact this is. And we reached about 130,000 across the state at one point. So we knew that we'd get a lot more by sunrise, and certainly the damage reports have been filling in.
Yeah, and back to that point before about the very high winds, and those were what we in the business call non-convective winds. In other words, just plain old straight line winds away from a severe local storm, not really related to a thunderstorm, much less a tornado. We did have good sense that this storm was coming and it was going to be very bad. I say this storm, I mean the broad scale, larger scale features, which included the snow, squalls, including the dust, the wind, the fire, and the tornadic threat. So we all kind of knew that was coming. We wanted to get that word out as best as we could. But what about the fuller storm setup really hit you as a meteorologist? For me, we're used to tornadoes, we're used to wind. I kind of sat back and looked at this, obviously with the luxury, as you said, from a distance. But for me, the time of year, obviously, but the straight line winds over such a broad area upstream from you, in this case, mostly Kansas, a little bit of Nebraska, that's the thing that really struck me as, wow, there's probably a little more going on here than what we're used to forecasting. What are your thoughts on it?
There's no question. The atmosphere brought these winds. Thunderstorms weren't the culprit. I think the wind gust that the thunderstorms produced in Des Moines got up to 65 miles per hour. But after that line, that convective line of thunderstorms moved through, there was a gust to 74 miles per hour, which is Des Moines' highest wind speed on record outside of a thunderstorm. That happened about an hour and a half to 2 hours after the storms moved out. We saw those records fall across the entire state. This was a very high wind driven event that wasn't based on thunderstorms. And these were the records that we were breaking yesterday. And it all started at 5 o'clock in the morning. To just let this sink in, at 5 in the morning, we broke the daily record high temperature in Des Moines. By noontime, we broke the record for the month of December. And then we tacked on 3 more degrees after that. Got up to 74 degrees for a high. That's not normal. And it isn't a coincidence. And areas that were digging out of 6 to 10 inches of snow last week were some of the areas that were hit hardest by this storm last night. There were active tornado warnings with confirmed tornadoes in an area that had a snowpack up until Sunday.
And that's not something I ever remember seeing or hearing about. I mean, it may have happened in the past, but that's not something I ever recall, since I started studying meteorology back in the 80s, that there's a tornado on the ground where there's snowpack.
Yeah.
So, back to the point before, and because this comes up, and I think we need to talk about it, is the climate change aspect. The fact that you can have this much warmth this far north at this time of the year certainly suggests that the atmosphere was juiced. In other words, it was getting more energy. It's got more energy in the past now than it has in the past. I mean, it obviously is too early to attribute this to a certain percentage. But would you agree, at least in principle, that there's more going on here now than in the atmosphere 30 or 40 years ago?
there wasn't a tornado outbreak like this on record in Iowa. Minnesota saw a tornado for the first time during the month of December. I try to stay up on the research and see where where attribution science is connecting the dots. And I know that there isn't a lot of evidence right now. And if you look at the scale of weather events that you can tie where you can tie it together with climate change, it does rank a little bit lower on the scale. But at the same point, you have to look at the atmospheric setup and the extremes that we had going into this event. If we weren't in the 70s yesterday, even if we weren't in the 60s yesterday, we wouldn't have had this. It's as simple as that. So maybe there aren't more tornadoes, and maybe you can attribute the increase in EF0s and EF1s to our Doppler radar technology with correlation coefficient, with cell phone video of these things. But the atmosphere is a lot more favorable for setups like the one we saw yesterday. The Gulf of Mexico is multiple degrees Celsius above average. You have that warm, we had dew points in the low 60s yesterday.
Yeah. And you don't have a bunch of mature corn sending moisture back into the atmosphere either. I mean, this is all what we call advection, or just the very deep winds from the south and southwest, bringing the warmth that far north.
Sean, it was eerie when we left the station last night, and I mean, I've covered hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, Dorian on location, and feeling the wind here, not in a tropical setting, was an interesting experience. But when we stepped outside, we smelled smoke. I got to our car in the parking lot, and it was covered in dust and mud. And it was looking at that and thinking, this mud and this dust originated in Colorado, in Kansas, and made it all the way to Iowa on these record-breaking winds in this setup. And the smoke that we were smelling, which was actually overwhelming our 911 call centers because people were calling and saying, we smell smoke, were from wildfires in Kansas that were brought on and made worse by this atmospheric setup. So that really, as a meteorologist, is what kind of stood out for me when I was leaving a 16-hour day at work.
Yes, it is a very different atmosphere than what you and I grew up with. So Chris, thanks for talking this morning. Appreciate your hard work for you and the team there in Des Moines, Iowa. Hopefully everybody gets the power back on shortly, because just looking at the odds, it's in the 20s to about 30. And if I'm looking at the odds correctly, you're still pulling a 20-mile-an-hour wind from the west. So stay warm. The wind chills got to be just nasty. And I hope everybody there has a good holiday season. Chris, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you, Sean. Thanks for having me.